In this podcast, we'll be talking about our history as a neurodivergent community with Kieran Rose. We're going to cover the period from the early 1960s through to the early 2000s. This includes talk of our lack of theory of mind, the triad of impairments, and vaccines causing autism. We wouldn't normally share this information with you, but we strongly believe in order to understand where we are as a community, we need to understand our shared history. As ever, there are some light and wholesome moments, and we hold our space with warmth and care. We cannot account for everyone's trauma or triggers within our podcast, or what people might find personally jarring. But in these few episodes, it is likely to be jarring. So if you need to listen at another time, if this isn't the right time for you, hit the pause button, get a cup of tea, and do whatever you would like for your own self-care. Welcome to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nick King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox. And together we're here to explore, understand and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws. Myself, Kate Fox and Kieran is here with us, and we are going to continue our discussion on the history of autism, and we're going to talk about this sort of this middle timeline in the sort of the 1960s-ish to maybe the noughties. Okay, where should we start, Kieran? If we're thinking about sort of the 60s, 70s kind of thing, who should we start with?
So we have to kind of recognize that while all the behaviourism rubbish was going on and all the empty fortress rubbish, the Bettelheim kind of rubbish was going on, that there was a concurrent narrative that was running alongside that, which was started by Bernard Rimland, who was a psychologist in the United States who looked at autistic. We have to remember the context of this being the 1960s and the information that was available. But so a lot of his work is still problematic retrospectively, but he was trying to look at autistic people through a much more humanizing lens. So for the first time, somebody started bringing in around sensory profiles and things like that. First time that we knew at this point anyway, started bringing work around sensory profiles and actually, you know, maybe if we tinker with the environment a little bit, someone might have a little bit of a better experience and things. So Rimland wasn't a saint by all stretch and purposes, but a lot of the work that he did was a lot more progressive. So there's kind of two train tracks running here. And his was kept a lot quieter. His train was running a lot slower than the other one, which was really building steam over the course of the years. But then once we jump into the 70s, there was started to be lots of questions around more, well, hold on a minute. This narrative around autism has very much around kind of these are maybe children and young people that don't speak, that might have physical things going on. There was a slight better recognition that maybe the autism isn't the right term for everything that's going on in someone's life. And one of the big proponents of that was actually Lorna Wing, who was one of the early founders of the National Autistic Society, was a psychologist, a clinical psych and a researcher. And she was working with a cohort of children through the 1970s in London. And she recognized them as being autistic children, but she was restricted from identifying them as autistic children because they didn't completely fit the profile of autism at that point. So the DSM was very new. The diagnostic manual that we used was very new then, and she wanted to broaden that diagnostic structure, and was told that she could not, and was told that she had to come up with a whole other context for what was going on with these kids that was related to it and adjacent to it, but wasn't the same kind of narrative. And what's really interesting was at that time, her husband, who was also a clinical psychologist, had gone to a conference in Holland. And at that conference, there was a German-speaking man who was talking about autistic psychopathy and was talking about this cohort of children that he'd been working on all through the years. It turned out that that was Hans Asperger. So he brought this information back to Lorna, who was very much latched onto it and was like, excellent, because this fits the profile that I want to use to describe these children. And then over time, that became what was known as Asperger's syndrome. So we look back at Asperger's syndrome through a problematic lens, and it as a diagnosis, retrospectively, we can look back and say it probably would have been better had that not have been created. Had we broadened the diagnostic constructs and incorporated different experiences in that, it would have been better. But I think at the time, Lorna's hands were tied, so we ended up with this actually very short diagnostic lifespan of Asperger's syndrome, which started in about 1992 and ended in about 2013. So it actually wasn't around for a great amount of time, but Lorna's work within that has really, really been important. And I look at Lorna through a kind of a grey lens in terms of she did some amazing progressive work, but also gave us the triad of impairments, which is quite a horrific framing for a human being again. So, so again, we're in this kind of middle ground where people are trying out new things and trying new concepts and new ideas. And Lorna really brought back into the conversation about women and girls as well. So there was a very important thing there, and recognizing that this had been a boy narrative for a long time and that we needed to broaden that. So Lorna sits in a kind of a grey area for me, and I think that's really important within the context of this time frame, that this is a middle ground and a stepping stone to where we're going, hopefully, in the future. And I think she played a really important role there. Kate, I know you've probably got a million things to say there.
Oh, well, and I suppose it's reminding me very much, because you're saying she fits in this grey area. Actually, although this is partly a history of people, undoubtedly, but they're always people in a context, aren't they? And Lorna was very much, as you've made really clear, working in this particular context. I think of Lorna as the first person who ever suggested to me that a fluorescent light, could be dimmed to make me happier. And that was amazing. And she was also, because I met her in 2010 when I was researching a first version of my show. And she was very frank about feeling that probably she herself was autistic, actually. She made a joke about the rows of psychiatrist men in grey suits who themselves were all clearly autistic too, actually. And I feel like that, and she kind of explained about the, imagination in the triad of impairments being deeply misunderstood, and that she regretted using the word imagination because it made people think, oh, autistic people don't have an inner life, which, as we know, has been an ongoing problem.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to have had the privilege of meeting her and then feeling this great insight of, oh God, yes, she was a being of her time.
It's funny, I never met Lorna, but I have a secondary story to Lorna, in that I was delivering training a few years ago and was talking about Lorna and the triad of impairments and Asperger's and how that was developed. And one of the delegates on the training put their hand up and said, "Oh, can I tell you a story about Lorna Wing?" And I was like, "Absolutely." So she, as a little girl, grew up in the house next door to where Lorna Wing lived when she was doing her early research. And she said Lorna knocked on the door one day and had said to this girl's parents, "I'm doing this research into a particular group of children. Can I use your children as part of this research in terms of having a comparison? That these are autistic children, how they develop, and this is how normal, as she described it, children develop." Because she'd been watching these kids playing in their garden, and she thought that was a beautiful example of child development. And she said, this little girl who was now on my training said, the ironic thing is that we form part of that early research, and now me and my brother both have an autism diagnosis. So it just goes to show how, and this isn't a reflection on Lorna at all, again, this is the context of we don't know what we don't know, that the models we build are not good enough. The models we've built historically are not good enough because we've been limited by our ideas and the constructs that we've made. And you know, that this is a much more humanistic approach is needed to be taken to this, thinking about the different experiences that people have, what looks different. And actually, if we this is why it's so important to deconstruct this history, because if we don't deconstruct the problematicness of this history, then we stay trapped within the same boxes that we've created for ourselves. And then that becomes just, again, it has a negative impact on all of us.
Perfect. I often, I know me and you have done this sort of like privately and within the inside of autism, but we've been asked how we think in like 20, 50 years time, we will be viewed as people who have contributed to research, as people who have done something that has been different and moved outside of boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And I reflect on that quite a lot, you know, like how historically, where might I be problematic in the future? Because I don't think many people, I think some people set out and had poor intentions, but I don't think the majority of us set out to be problematic.
No.
And to create situations that bring hardship to autistic people. I don't think many people do that at all. It just,
I have
you're in your context of your time and your limitations,
yeah.
aren't you?
I've got no doubt that 50 years time, well, if people even remember us, like, I'm not bothered about whether I get remembered or not, you know. But if people look back on the work that we did and identify it as problematic, I've got no doubt that it will be stuff that we do will be identified as problematic in the future, because we're still at the beginnings of things. So their mistakes will be made. But what I would hope is that if they compared the work that we are doing now and so many other good researchers are doing now and so many good clinicians, because there are really good clinicians out there as well, that if they look back on that work as problematic, it won't be as problematic as the work that happened previously. You know, I am all up for everything that I say being challenged and pushed back on and being wrong. You know, we evolve, we change. I'm more than open to that. But I would like to think that we're trying to at least to look through a much more humanizing lens, and a lens that doesn't other. And that's the difference, I think, because I think, again, the context of the time previously, you know, all the way through up to the kind of probably the 2010s, really, they're like that recent, that it has been a very much an othering us and them narrative. And even people like Lorna were using that framework of I'm the right way to be and this is the wrong way to be. You know, so it's so messy. I use that word all the time. It is so messy. None of it is black and white. It's all shades of grey. But, you know, hopefully in the future they'll look back on the stuff, that the conversations that we're having now, and say, well, at least they were trying, you know, trying to do something better, trying to build something more inclusive, and you know, we can only try.
Hello, lovely listener. Are you enjoying the podcast? If you would like to support us, you can leave a tip via the PayPal link on our website at www.neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk. And every little bit will help us keep the show going, and we will truly appreciate it.
Because we're going to talk about Simon Baron Cohen at some point, aren't we? And I know he would absolutely say, but I was trying. I want to make things better. I absolutely want to be more humanizing. I know he would.
Do you want to share with our listeners your first time you met Simon Baron Cohen, Kieran? Do you?
Yeah, that's fine. So I was diagnosed by Simon. Yeah, in 2003, I spent the day with Simon. Me and my eldest sister spent the day with Simon. And I knew nothing about Simon then. I knew nothing really about autism then. And had a lovely day with Simon. Me and Simon challenged each other in some ways. I didn't agree with some of the things or some of the framings that he had of me. And I dug out my diagnostic report last year, and I hadn't actually looked at it in about 20 years. And some of his framings of me are very interesting. Framing me as very rigid when I was trying to have a conversation with him about empathy, ironically. So So I've personally, I have nothing against Simon, and I really hear what you're saying there, Kate, in terms of I know that Simon would say that he was trying and he wants to be more humanistic. He fails really badly at being humanistic. He's not good at being humanistic at all. And he has work he's done has changed over the years, but I do always get the sense that he's pulled back to his othering, marginalizing kind of frame of reference. And I think there is a very good reason for that. And I've thought on this quite a lot over the last year, because there is a direct pipeline, an actual clear and direct pipeline between Asperger's work and Baron Cohen's work. Because Asperger was the first person to talk about theory of mind in relation to autistic people or children as he was working with then. The person that translated Asperger's work and actually had a bit of a relationship towards the end of Asperger's life with Asperger was Uta Frith, who has done some good early work and some incredibly problematic work around things like theory of mind and stuff. And she was Baron Cohen's supervisor. So when I said in the first podcast around there have been prominent researchers who have directly paraphrased Asperger in terms of talking about the engineers and the scientists and the people who are more problematic, shall we say, in their view, Baron Cohen is one of those people, and he has a direct pipeline of work that comes down and feeds into his thinking. So I think for Baron Cohen, I think it's difficult for him to move out of that problematic framework, that othering framework, because that's been his whole career. And that's his early work and that's his early understandings. And all of us know the things that we learn first are the things we go back to. That's how heuristics work in our head, and that's how our biases work. We're always pulled back to and it takes a real lot to challenge yourself. And I don't think he's very good at being reflective.
That's a very tactful way of putting it. I'm aware that we are.
I have been less tactful.
Yes. We're talking about Simon as if he's some sort of like our problematic colleague in the office who we expect everyone to know. So could you give us a little primer to the man himself, who is indeed the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen?
He's the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen. And I did in no way, shape or form walk into his office in 2003 and shout out, "Is it because I is autistic?" I did do that, embarrassingly so, looking back. I did actually have a conversation with my sister about wearing a big gold chain as well. I didn't. Yeah, so Simon's work, unfortunately, I've described Simon as having blood on his hands in the past. And I really genuinely feel that is a factual statement, because Simon's PhD was on theory of mind. He used an experiment called the Salian test, which is a really problematic experiment, and his work has not been replicated ever again. I would like to point out as well, he worked with a very tiny cohort of children and basically established from that autistic children aren't very good at reading human beings' minds. And I don't know any human being that's very good at reading a human being's minds, but his narrative that bled out of that was that autistic people struggle with theory of mind, which is effectively empathy, putting yourself in the shoes of another person and thinking about what that person is thinking in their heads. So we've established now, when we get onto the good stuff, we'll talk about the double empathy problem and how that's completely boshed all of that work, because it's a human problem. But Simon's early work was framed around that. He published further papers and wrote a book all about how autistic people lack theory of mind. He framed that also in the reference of something called the extreme male brain model, which is basically that all autistic people are men, whether they're women or not. We all think in men. Like, it's a very generalizing, and there's not much science behind it as well. There's very little science and a very poor understanding of gender. And the neurology of the brain in terms of the differences between men and women, which is minimal. So actually, his work has reinforced the lack or delayed the lack of identification of autistic women and girls. And that's why I talk about him having blood in his hands. Our community has an enormous suicide rate, the highest rate of suicide in any group of human beings on the planet. And he has contributed directly to that through the increased under recognition of autistic women and girls, and also has then perpetuated this myth that autistic people lack empathy, that we are emotionless, that we are that he's continued that empty fortress narrative, that we're empty vessels, that we don't have feelings, and he's tried to kind of over the years brush that off and say that, oh no, that's not what I was talking about. But I'm a huge believer that intent and impact are two completely different things. The impact of his work is that he has contributed to the under recognition of autistic people and the dehumanization and stigmatization of autistic people directly. And what's really interesting as well is that from a cultural media narrative, there is this consistent ideal that every time there's a mass shooting or a murder or that person is autistic, that narrative that they were a loner, that, you know, they didn't have friends, that they were emotionless and all of that. There's a media representation that immediately comes out after anything that's happened. The reason that becomes attributed to autistic people is that after he wrote his book and his papers around autistic people lacking theory of mind and empathy, he wrote a book about serial killers lacking theory of mind of empathy. So those two things were standalone products. But from a cultural perspective, somebody looks at a prominent researcher who's wheeled out to talk about autism every 3 minutes on everything that goes out into the public world, and who then writes a book using the same framework about murderers and serial killers that he has used for autistic people. Well, and of course the public are going to go and put those two things together. So, you know, and again, this is my point about he seriously lacks the ability to reflect, really lacks the ability to reflect. And I don't tend to armchair diagnose people, but having spent the day with him, he's the most autistic person I have ever met.
Yes.
And you didn't see it at all. And he had a sister. Has a sister that had learning disabilities and probably retrospectively would have been identified as being autistic as well. So it's genetic and hereditary, Simon. Look in the mirror.
Yeah, and the irony, because then I almost want to go, see, because look at Simon and his lack of empathy and his rigidity and his systemicness, and then I have to go, oh, hang on, sorry, we are also trying to demolish that particular
stereotype
that he does in fact embody. And there's something really interesting that then happens there within that whole set of narratives. But of course, if you are the person who is saying these things from an institute in Cambridge, you possess the cultural and academic legitimacy for people to really hear you, despite the many very valid critiques that you've so beautifully summarised of his work. Can we move on from SBC? I'm beginning to want to my empathy is
Become a serial killer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, just not serial, you know, just sorry,
Just one.
just the one. No, compassion and empathy.
No.
Well, I genuinely, do you know what I once? Sorry, I said we were going to move on from him, and now I'm chatting on, and we have so much history. But I genuinely envisaged once having a protest outside Simon's office for a long time, but the protest would be to just go and be really empathic with him and be like, oh, Simon, we know how you feel. And like, I don't know, hand him out flowers and cups of tea and just like empathy bomb him. And I thought that would be really, it's still a good idea, actually. One day, if he says anything annoying, we'll do it.
Well, you won't have long to wait because it's usually about every 5 minutes, isn't it? And that's the thing. He's not, I know we want to move on from him, but he's moved on from those things, but the world hasn't. And that's the key thing to remember here. He hasn't moved on from being problematic because he's still, he's got no, it's like he's covered up his eyes. He's got big heavy boots on and he just goes plodging through problematic puddles where he just jumps up and down in them and splodges everywhere. And it's As like Spectrum 10K, the recent kind of large study that he got enormous funding from, which I was part of a protest that ended up getting that stopped and well temporarily and hopefully reframed. It's all gone very quiet from that end. But you know, recent research around kind of he's wanted to investigate the suicidality in teenagers and things using people's diaries, and it's like so many things, and you're just like, Simon, just go and be quiet in a corner somewhere, please. Read a book. And, you know, let somebody else, it's time somebody else took over. And I think that's part of the problem that many, and that's not just with academics, sometimes this happens with advocates as well. There comes a point where you just think, it's time you retired like 30 years ago. Like, let it go now. You've done your bit. Just sit back and let somebody else take over. And he doesn't seem to be doing that, unfortunately.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time. Who else could we do?
Should we do Wakefield?
Oh no!
Go
I
on
think
then.
we have to.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
No, I think we do, especially in relation to COVID, because Wakefield's again become part of that narrative, hasn't he? So
did we all catch the autisms from a vaccine?
my son got a vaccine the other day, and we laughed about him being leveled up.
Yeah.
He's moved from a level 1 to a level 2 now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Wakefield. I hate talking about him. I despise that. Like, there are very few people on the planet that I actively despise, and I actively despise Andrew Wakefield. So, he was a researcher into gut bacteria in the mid to late 90s, and was approached by a group of parents from the US who had tried and failed to sue the vaccine industry and pharmaceutical companies for the fact that their children were autistic, because they felt that the vaccines had caused their children to be autistic. So they'd failed with that. So he was approached by a lawyer representing them and was basically offered a shed load of money for proving the link, and then went and did some awful invasive research on, again, a very small cohort of children. And before he had been published and peer reviewed, he called a press conference, again at the behest of the group of families and the lawyer, and there were UK national newspapers there. And he'd never directly said it, but he intimated that he had identified a link between specifically the MMR vaccine and autism, which then the next day, the headline on The Sun, which is a major national UK tabloid, was "Vaccines Cause Autism," or MMR specifically causes autism, which then caused an enormous panic. The rates of people uptaking vaccines went through the floor. And we had eradicated measles by that point, and it is no longer eradicated. So that's the kind of long-term effect of this. And there is still, even today, a lot of hesitancy and a lack of confidence in vaccines for lots of things. We saw this through, the COVID period and the COVID vaccine, and how much fear there was around that, and fear mongering, which we can directly track back to Wakefield. So large organizations picked up this narrative as well. So Autism Speaks, which is a US charity, which has a massive influence, and has had historically a massive influence on autistic people all over the world in terms of their narratives and the research that they've funded. They were formed on the basis of Wakefield being correct. It was to prove the link between autism and vaccines. And Wakefield, eventually, his paper was retracted. It was published, and then it was retracted a few months later, literally struck off. He was struck off as a doctor. He had his clinical license taken away from him, is no longer allowed to practice or call himself Dr. Andrew Wakefield. But then he went to the US and became a kind of mini celebrity in the US. He ended up with a supermodel girlfriend. He was with Elle McPherson for quite a number of years. Oh yeah, lives in a mansion. Has been bankrolled by the anti-vax movement in the US, and they've created films and movies and things. And he's still rolled out at conferences all over the world. And these problematic organizations like Autism Speaks, who don't out loud don't use these narratives anymore, but it's still very a subliminal core of cause and cure narratives. So they've got their platform off of this ideology and are still going and are still influencing research, and predominantly across Europe, they're still influencing research. So that's Andy, and another fun guy.
I mean, really. Okay, so we're going to wrap up in 2 minutes. I'm going to unilaterally. It turns out there's a Buddhist quote that I think is very relevant that I happen to be looking at today, and that's going to be the last things we say. Sorry, probably the last time neurotypicals don't juggle chainsaws. We'll end with a Buddhist quote, but it has to be done. But before then, can you give us a quick preview, Kieran? Tell us that in the third part, there's some good news.
There is good news. We're going to be looking at some good stuff, some real game-changing stuff, which is going to be opposing a lot of the stuff that we've talked about and actually going off in directions that was never, ever, ever envisaged.
Good. We need that. And as we've been thinking about kind of wider context, but actually it is very clear to me that certain individuals can have massive impacts, huge impacts on what happens. I want to quote this from the Buddhist philosopher Shantideva. He said, "This entire world is disturbed with insanity due to the exertions of those who are confused about themselves."
Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nick King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website, neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk, to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.
We hope you enjoyed the time we spent with Kieran Rose, the autistic advocate. And if you want to know more from Kieran's perspective, he has an amazing course called The Inside of Autism, available from his website, theautisticadvocate.com, in which he covers many topics in depth, including our history. As ever, if you want to share your thoughts about a podcast, please get in touch at neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk.